Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back. Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of April 27th. I am Michael James, and as I said at the outset of the show, our friend, the wonderful organizer, activist, Slim Coleman, Walter Slim Coleman, has passed. And I couldn't think of anyone more to share some information about him other than Sue Klonsky, who has been doing this now for a few of our good friends who've passed away, sharing some memories. And I asked her if she'd come on and talk about what she knew about Slim and some of the work that he did over the years. I first remember him showing up probably around the same time you did, Sue, at the SDS office. He came from Cleveland. I think you were coming from California with your husband, incomparable Michael Klonsky. And I'm not sure if I have the years correct, if they intersected, but we all knew each other back in the day from our membership in Students for Democratic Society. Tell us what you remember about meeting Slim.
Well, first of all, thanks for having this conversation, Michael. Reverend Walter Slim Coleman came up to Chicago along with his then partner and fellow organizer, Kathy Archibald. They had worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as volunteers in Arkansas and later in Atlanta. And when that organization, known popularly as SNCC, decided to send their white volunteer members off to address racism in white communities where we came from, the then executive director of SNCC, James Foreman, directed and recommended that Slim and Kathy come to Chicago and work with Students for Democratic Society. And so that's what happened. They showed up, and pretty soon, and they were so skilled at organizing and at figuring out suitable tactics for building the anti-war movement and linking it to the civil rights movement. We're talking about 1967, 1968. They were so skilled at it that they quickly assumed a position of major leadership within the organization here in Chicago, where our national office used to be located at the intersection of Madison and Ashland at 1608 West Madison Street, which if you look at it today, it's a parking lot. It's not, nothing is there anymore.
Should be a historical register for the SDS office.
Yeah, I'm afraid that ship has sailed. But in any case, the thing that was so interesting about Slim, and I do remember meeting him, is he was from Lubbock, Texas. He had a Texan way of speaking. He was extremely tall. I have no idea how tall he was, but to me, he looked, extremely tall, well over 6 feet. And his friends called him Slim because he was skinny as a rail. And he was often very quiet, taking in the discussions in meetings, and then coming out with one succinct statement about what he thought we ought to do in one situation or another. And sometimes we had pretty thorny and challenging situations to figure out. He was not one to fly off the handle or do anything, I think, rash or reckless. He was very thoughtful. He was highly educated. He'd been a Harvard student as an undergrad. He eventually, probably in his late 40s or so, went to Garrett Theological Seminary and became ordained and was a minister in the United Methodist Church up until his last days, having led two congregations, one in Humboldt Park called St. Adalbert's United Methodist on North Avenue, and one over in Pilsen called Lincoln United Methodist Church, which was like next door to his house. And he was always an impressive speaker. If you go on YouTube today and put his name in, you'll see him speaking in many kinds of settings, from rallies to scholarly seminars and symposia looking at the 60s and reflecting on it. And one of the best ones, if you do a little Google search for it, is a lengthy interview that he did for the documentary project called Eyes on the Prize. It's really good. And a lot of it addresses the role of white radicals in and around us and as allies to the civil rights movement. There's few people who have the breadth of experience and were able to kind of reflect on it as he did. So I value that. I've been listening to a lot of those videos and videotaped interviews the last couple days, partly just to recall that voice. Anyway, that was my first encounter with Slim, was at the SDS national office in a time of great social upheaval and turmoil. He was a very steadying voice.
That was good introduction. I remember, being in the SDS office with him. I remember driving up to Madison to an SDS meeting with him, and I remember the summer of, it was probably 67. There was I was working, I was writing for the Movement newspaper. I was working with Joint Community Union, and there was a number of people, including Slim, who were doing an anti-draft summer event. And I remember being very critical of it, thinking that it would interfere with our long haul, ongoing organizing in a particular community. And later I would have to say I was totally wrong, because it just broke wide open. People were opposed to the war. But I remember that summer when there were a number of people, and there was a debate in the Movement newspaper, basically between my position on pretty critical of that, and a number of people who were going to take the war to the neighborhoods. Do you remember anything about that summer?
Well, I know that summer in Madison, Wisconsin, there was a national conference on organizing draft resistance, encouraging young people to avoid the draft, to avoid being sent off to the meat grinder that was the Vietnam War. And it was called by the Wisconsin Draft Resistance Union, which was a student-based organization in Madison. And an astonishing number of people showed up from far-flung parts of the country, including rural areas in like Idaho. And it spun off a number of projects, including what they called GI coffee houses. You may remember these.
Oh,
They
yes.
were places where active duty soldiers, whether they were drafted or enlistees, could come and meet like-minded people and find out what to do, find others who were thinking along the same lines as them, who were hearing from guys coming back from Vietnam about how terrible the situation was and how stupid and destructive the war was. Anyways, there were many people who are still organizing today who were a part of that movement, and that project was part of what was called Vietnam Summer, the summer of 1967, when a lot of money was raised all over the country to support organizing against the draft, which was driving more and more people to oppose the war. Not just out of self-interest, but because they were seeing how needless, senseless, and destructive it was, not just, of course, for ourselves, but for the millions of Vietnamese and other people in Southeast Asia who got killed and maimed by the U.S. war that was supposedly to stop communism in Southeast Asia. He was a strategic part of that movement.
Yeah, back in the day, it was started off with everyone was for the war in Vietnam. By the end of the war, it was 70% of the people were opposed to the war, and it happened very quickly. Later, people wanted to bomb Iraq. They forgot that they had been opposed to the Vietnam War, but that's another question. The thing that comes up a lot and that Slim gets a lot of credit for is the organizing of voter registration here in Chicago to elect Harold Washington. How about
Yes.
sharing with our listeners and our viewers some of that? Because all of us were involved in bringing Harold into office, and it was one of the greatest moments in Chicago history. And he played a major part in that. Slim did.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Because he had experienced the really life or death struggles to register voters in the Black Belt South, in Arkansas and Sunflower County, in the Southwest Georgia, and he understood it well. He understood how to talk to people about the importance of it and what it meant in terms of gaining some political power in this city. When Harold Washington was first approached, he was a U.S. congressman at that time. He was approached to run for mayor of Chicago. He was very dismissive of those who approached him, most of whom were Black civil rights leaders, Southsiders such as the late, great Timuel Black, Lou Palmer, and many others. He said, no, unless you can show me that you can register 150,000 voters and raise $250,000. And over the course of the next few months, through careful planning and organizing, we registered 250,000 voters, new voters citywide, but particularly on the south and west sides. And Slim led the effort to register voters and to get out the vote subsequently on the north and northwest side. And that was no small accomplishment. The skillful combination of community organizing and outreach to people in all different kinds of organizations, coming to them around issues that were important to them and that were being neglected. And secondly, the nascent campaign succeeded in raising $250,000. And they were able to go back to Harold Washington and say, well, we got 250,000 new voters and we got $250,000. What do you say now? And he said, well, you got me. And so he ran, and because of his particular dynamism and charisma, plus his extreme brilliance as an orator and his tireless campaigning, it was possible to make it happen and to beat the pants off the machine. So Slim was kind of one of the key people responsible for organizing outside the Black community. There were many other people who played an incredibly important role. Some of them veterans of the civil rights movement, some of them young people who just got fired up and turned on by the very idea that there could be a different way of governing in Chicago. And he was able to capture a lot of that energy. In fact, I remember very well going to a community meeting in my neighborhood at a church on the northwest side, where Slim and a very young Black state legislator by the name of Monica Faith Stewart, African-American young woman. She was the youngest person to ever serve in the Illinois legislature at that time, gave a pitch to us to get out and get the clipboards and work the wards and get people signed up. And they were inspirational. They got people on their feet.
Well, that was a great campaign, that the Harold Washington campaign, and it ushered in a growing trend toward a progressive people in the city council, and perhaps in the mayorship too. We'll see how that all plays out. Slim Coleman ended up he spent some time in Uptown. and they put out a paper, Keep Strong. He was very much involved with Helen Schiller, who became an alderwoman. They all worked together. He then, a little bit later, got involved with immigrant rights and did some work with Congressman Gutierrez and helped to get him elected. And he received a lot of attention. And one of the top stories back in 2006 was when a young woman named Elvira Arellano took refuge in the church when ICE or whatever the forces that be wanted to deport. Share a little bit about that time.
Well, that's exactly right. She was willing and able to be a test case of the sanctuary policy and its enforceability. And she had a young son. I think he was like maybe 6 or 8 years old at the time, and they stayed in the church for quite some time. It was more than a year. I'm not sure exactly how many months they were there. There were immense rallies and prayer services and downstairs in the church, and there was a little apartment upstairs. And she was able to stay out of the hands of ICE and continue. And, this was before the internet and before, FaceTime and like what we're doing now, before being able to do outreach to people with the ease that we have it now. And he was able to get the word out. And I very well remember being so moved by the fact that you would see people coming and dropping off like sacks of groceries and stuff at the church for the Arellanos and to keep the project going, because she became a symbol for the sanctuary movement. And in fact, when Harold was the mayor, he was the one who enacted the welcoming city or sanctuary city ordinance as by executive order that some folks have recently tried to undo because they're afraid Chicago's getting too crowded. But he stood up against that very strongly.
There is a book out called Elvira's Faith, which is The Fight for Immigration Reform, a view from the grassroots. And it's Slim wrote a lot of it. There are other people in it too. Yeah. And just so I don't forget, there is going to be a memorial service, a citywide memorial service for him on May 30th, 6 to 8 at Operation Push, which is at 930 East 50th Street. And we'll mention it over and over before that